Brewing Network.
Welcome to the Beer Before Glory podcast. My name is Justin Crossley.
And I'm Matt Brynildson.
And we are your hosts in this all-new podcast series, Beer Before Glory. Our goal is to dive deep into craft beer, and we're going to do it with our friends and experts and people that we admire in the craft beer industry. And our first guests today are no exception at all to that criteria. Jeremy Marshal from Lagunitas Brewing Company. Welcome, Jeremy.
What's happening, gentlemen?
Yeah, Jeremy's just a fantastic brewer that I've known for a long time, so I'm just excited to have you here. And Evan Price from Green Cheek down in Orange, California. Welcome, Evan.
Woo!
Yeah, Evan, just as excited as I am, which is great. My only complaint about Evan is that I don't get to have his beer enough, to be honest with you.
Oh, man. Yeah. We got to change that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm up here in Northern California, so we definitely have to fix that. Every time I do get to try your beer at different festivals, and of course, I've had you on the show before in some of your past lives as a brewer, I just really enjoy it.
And what was really cool is we had the opportunity to introduce these two guys together. Apparently, they have not met. I don't know how that's possible.
Right. Two great brewers. So that's a fun part for us. So just briefly, the Beer Before Glory podcast kind of started as this idea. Matt and I, over the years, got to collaborate and work together at the Firestone Walker Invitational Beer Festival, among other things. But at that festival, we created the Behind the Beer stage, where I was invited to interview brewers just like this and just talk about different topics and really kind of dive deep for about an hour-long format. We did that for years. And of course, right now, festivals and events are on hiatus for the time being. But I thought, it's really something that we can still do. And not only then would I get to kind of moderate these professionals that I love to listen to, but Matt would get to do what he likes to do anyway, which is hang out with brewers and talk about beer. So that's kind of what happened, right, Matt? We just thought, why don't we just do this as a podcast?
Yeah, and I never got to enjoy it as much as I should at the Invitational because I'm playing host, but both of you guys have been there. So, I mean, you've seen it. The Invitational is just kind of a blur. It's like a wedding every year for me. It's like people show up and then I wake up and they're gone. And I can't remember if I got to talk to everybody and I felt like I only spent a moment with everybody. So this is a little slower pace and we'll get to ask all the questions we wanted to ask.
Right. And so for those of you viewing and listening over the course of several episodes, it's kind of just a longer version of what Matt and I like to do, which is talk to brewers and learn more about craft beer. So today's topic is on the evolution of the IPA. And I'm not going to lie, we kind of chose IPA because it's obviously pretty attention grabbing for a first podcast. But it's also something that gives us a lot to talk about and is near and dear to all of these brewers' hearts. And it's an everlasting beer style. And we thought we're not here to necessarily give you the history of the IPA, which is long and fascinating. In fact, a mutual friend of ours, Mitch Steele, wrote the book on IPA. And I would, free plug for Mitch, I'd go buy that if you want to learn the whole history of the IPA. But we just wanted to talk about kind of how it's evolved. And because it's still such an exciting style, especially right now, what's happening with it and haze and gosh, even the debate between West Coast and haze is a lot of fun for me. So that's why we chose this topic. A little bit about Jeremy, I'll let him kind of speak for his position. But as the brewmaster of Lagunitas, Matt and I were kind of talking about this earlier, and we kind of thought, wow, Jeremy's probably brewed more IPA, by barrel than any brewer on the planet ever. Do you think that's about right, Jeremy, with Lagunitas IPA being so popular?
Well, if you're only looking at the Lagunitas umbrella, if I have any brewers watching, they'll be like, that guy doesn't brew shit anymore.
I see.
But yeah, by brewery name, we're still the reigning champion of top SKU. Started, state of California, then it was country, and then globally, I believe, if you're just going by the numbers.
Yeah. So it's kind of a good starting point if we're talking about the evolution too. When did Lagunitas IPA first hit the market? Do you know that?
Yeah, around 1995 when I was in high school, and I don't know what Evan was up to, but
I was 10. Oh, wait, no, 12. 12. I was 12 in 95.
Okay. Yeah.
12.
Yeah.
So hopefully Evan was not drinking the Lagunitas IPA in 1995.
No, crushing it for sure.
Yeah.
Back then, Lagunitas was founded by truly an industry maverick, only often compared out there to Larry Bell is the only other person that kind of comes up in terms of just being a very different thinker. I like to say looking back, it was like working for a mix of Elon Musk and Frank Zappa combined, put together into this.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah. So you can imagine it was fun when it was fun, but it was also intense.
Sure.
And when Tony decided, because this was before me, that IPA was going to be the thing that we were going to go after, because of course the brewery we all emulated at the time was Sierra Nevada, so it was all about pale ales. Sure. Which is an interesting tie-in to the history of the Mitch Steele history of IPA. That it started as just a pale ale, but in 1995 it was like, we're gonna make this style, and we're gonna add all these BUs, huge one. You had a bitterness edition, a middle edition, a whirlpool edition, and then you dry hopped with Cascade and Centennial, like cutting edge stuff, and I think Anchor Liberty Ale was the first thing that really put like dry hopping with Cascade like on our palate maps. But then a lot of people were naysayers. They said, "Oh, you work for IPA? No one wants to drink that bitter stuff. Why don't you make an amber or a nice Pilsner?" Or I remember the beer landscape was very different back then, Yeah. Very different.
It was. So you were dry hopping that beer from day one?
From day one, the OG dry hop was Centennial and Cascade. And then as it evolved, it picked up Chinook and Simcoe was kind of the game changer. Obviously with Vinny being a big part of a champion behind that, along with our Jason Peralt and our friends at Yakima Chief, and people that just believed in that hop when no one else would. Simcoe to me was the game changing moment of IPA, but we just skipped so much IPA history just then.
Well, and I was going to take a step back because you mentioned Larry Bell, and that's where I cut my teeth. I went to high school and later college in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And Larry Bell was, the Tony of that region, and equally Centennial out there and brilliant at the same time. Yeah, and Two Hearted was, and I don't know for sure if the very first batch was dry hop, but I think it was, and it was Centennial. Yeah.
And Two Hearted, by the way, still every year gets ranked in the top 2 to 3 IPAs in the country, right?
It's up there.
Which is a testament, I think, to the beer, to the recipe, to the beer, and to the style. People still love a broad spectrum of IPAs, which is what I want to talk about, is how it's a broad spectrum. And by the way, Jeremy, Matt, I'm going to steal Matt's thunder just a little bit here. I like that you mentioned that you added additional hops to Lagunitas IPA as the years gone on, because as we're discussing this evolution of the IPA, these kind of throwbacks, they're still evolving too, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, when we did Can You Brew It, Lagunitas IPA, Brewing Network from Pacheco. Back in those days, live from your garage, and we gave out a recipe. That was a moment in time. There's new malts, there's new hops. It's a new world out there, right?
Yeah. See, I love that, and I think that consumers should know that. They, people just might go, "Oh, well, it's Lagunitas IPA. I've had that." I bet you haven't had it.
Jeremy, what did that original recipe look like for Lagunitas IPA, and where it continued to move, like dry hop amount or amount of crystal malt? Like, I'm super curious on this, like, original Lagunitas IPA, and then drinking it as a drinker now within the last 5 years. I feel like I'm very familiar with that beer.
Right. Well, that's an interesting question, because It was really different. It used to be very chewy. So for the homebrewers that are listening right now, the mash temperature for that beer used to be 160, which would be unheard of by today's standards. Yeah, we had to strike at 160. We had to use ungodly temperatures of hot liquor, and it was very high amount of English crystal, and around 60 lava bond. Always had about 6 to 8% Munich malt. Tony was very much into malted wheat. This is before the crusade against gluten and the crusade against grain and the whole, bread makes you fat movement, which I don't subscribe to because I love bread and liquid bread. So, but there was always about 10 to 15% wheat. And then the hop additions in the kettle were massive. It always started with a big addition of Eroica, which got pulled out of the ground for poor agronomics in the 90s. And we phased that out and we phased in Horizon. Kind of same story with Horizon. It was pulled out of the ground. So if you look nowadays, it's more of a CTZ kind of situation. But that was also a big part of, the dry hopping as well. Middle edition was Willamette, which is like a U.S. Fuggle, a hop that's not very interesting to very many people these days. A triploid that's more or less going away, very poor yield, all that kind of stuff. Big Cascade Whirlpool edition. Dry hop, I want to say when I started, I'm remembering climbing to the top of a 120 barrel tank in a very non-OSHA friendly manner at the time,
super
hanging
safe
to the side of a ladder with my bucket, my spray bottle, and my, sweating with my safety glasses on, everything wrong. And I would
have like a 1/2-inch port on the top,
of course,
hop it in. You're putting one pellet in at a time.
Always, yeah. Let us not forget the denucleation, right? When you pour a scoop in and the hop pellets levitate because you're knocking CO2 out. That's the moment when shove that thing over and put the PRV back on. It's about to blow. It's like a whale, man. You're sitting on top of a whale.
Yeah.
We all have a story about that. Matt and I have compared stories, and we've all got a picture somewhere. But it was one box of Centennial and one box of Cascade. Which would be about that'd be about 40 kilos. Sorry, I've gone full metric lately. That's 88 pounds in 100. And so it wasn't quite to that magical kind of like early 2000 dry hopping rate that began to define an IPA of a pound per barrel, which, at some point as things evolved, it became 2 pounds per barrel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Which is like the bottom standard, right? The 2 pounds,
yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, 2 pounds is boring.
I have a similar story because when we started dry hopping here, and it was 200 barrel tank, but probably about as high, like dangerously high in the air, 25, 30 feet, and we had nothing that would no ladder, and so we had a forklift that would fit between the tanks. I would have to go find a pallet of malt because the forklift 3-mast stuff wasn't quite high enough to crawl to the top of the tank. So I picked up a pallet of malt.
You had a spacer.
I learned to put some plastic over it because after a few eruptions of beer and you wrecked a pallet of malt, you learn to cover it. And then I take the buckets of hops and some sanitizer because that was important to kind of clean, and then go up there and then scale to the top and clamp onto something. And then I had like a funnel that was like, you got at the gas station to put your oil into the engine. And then, pitcher, oh, and then the tank would start to shake. You're like, oh, God, Here we go. Hand over the top for a little while.
Wow.
Dry hopping was truly exciting. We sound like a couple old men back in my day.
I have like such a similar story at a brewery that I worked at where it was just like, older tanks without any kind of newer, larger dry hop porter and everything else. And I'm just, I'm sitting directly on top of the tank with a funnel straight from a gas station, literally exactly the same thing. And I'm adding it. It's at the end of my day. And then all of a sudden it erupts. And I am sitting there on the top of the tank trying to, save my life, but then also save the beer. And I just get completely covered with beer. And then I have to drive home completely soaked with beer, but
right. Telling the police officer, I swear I didn't have a drink. I died.
No, Ossifer. Listen, Ossifer.
Yeah. So and techniques have changed too, and we're going to talk about that, a little later also. But since we're still at the beginning, I'm just curious, and I want to ask Evan and Matt both. But Matt, what was Firestone Walker's first IPA? Was it just a Firestone Walker IPA?
It's an interesting story that's been told many times, but Union Jack didn't come out until the brewery was already 10 years old. Here we were, okay. South of Sierra Nevada, Lagunitas, everyone's just cranking IPA. Stone, 2 hours south, cranking IPA. And somehow we thought we were going to differentiate ourselves by not making IPA until I think 2006.
Okay.
And then we succumbed to it. But interestingly enough, prior to that, we were making, I don't know if you remember this, but we were brewing under contract Humboldt Brewing Company's beers down here.
Oh, yeah.
We actually formulated I formulated Nectar IPA.
Yep.
And it went on to do pretty well, all things considered. And so, and funny enough, like you talk about the amount of caramel malt, I mean, that was very much G1 amber in color, because it was kind of like the hoppy version of Red Nectar, or the IPA version of Red Nectar. So it had even more caramel malt than should be there.
I see.
And again, Centennial, Cascade, maybe a little Chinook, racy,
Okay. But Union Jack was the first official Firestone Walker IPA then.
Yeah, and what was so cool about that is, we could go to school on Jeremy's beer, the Sierra Nevada beer, which would have been Celebration Ale in those days, was really kind of that like IPA everybody loved. And it was also a little bit amber in color. I had been brewing a lot of IPA back in Chicago. So when I was at Goose Island, I was brewing Goose IPA, or helped formulate and brew that beer. But yeah, so Union Jack, to answer your question, was the first one. Yep.
Okay. And then Evan, I do want to know like your first IPA as a professional brewer, but because we're so far back in the history, I actually want to know the first IPA that you drank and liked. Because I had an issue with IPAs as an early drinker. I had come directly over from domestic American lager to someone shoving, I think, a Sierra Nevada in my face, which I thought was awful until, a week later when they kept shoving them in my face and I never turned back. So I'm curious, which is the first one you liked?
Yeah, I mean, before I hit the like thing real quick, I think that the funny thing for me is I remember having going to a Stone beer dinner that was at a BJ's for a beer appreciation night that they were doing, and Stone was hosting. And I went through all these beers, and I couldn't have hated them more at that time in my life. And it wasn't until I was working in BJ's where I had a Piranha Pale Ale straight out of the bright tank the day that it was transferred and finished carbon up and everything. I think that was I feel like that was a filtered beer. But anyway, it was just that moment of having a fresh hoppy beer that blew my mind and immediately made me a lover of hoppy and bitter beer. And I think that that's something that I feel like resonates with a lot of people. And I think that just giving people fresh IPA ends up just being it's a world of a difference.
Oh man, for sure.
It is the beer that can, just change the fastest under the wrong conditions and be around too long. So it's an excellent point. So I do want to skip us ahead a little bit, because I feel like you guys, whether you meant to or not, kind of covered that basic recipe, that style, which was a little heavier on the crystal malt. Maybe just a slightly, balance was a real buzzword. And I think a key to, I think brewers maybe thought, well, it can't be overly, we have to somehow balance it for consumers to like it. But I do think that then somewhere in the middle of the IPA evolution, you stopped using middle edition hops, you lightened up on crystal malt, and for various reasons that I do want us to discuss, started leaning even more on the hops as the device to drive the IPA. Jeremy, does that sound about right to you if we were to skip to that point?
Yes, the crystal malt became the villain and also the source of all your oxidation, right? Because it's participating. There's strecheraldehydes and staling compounds and all kinds of things that were found. And then we dried out our beers. So we began. No longer were we mashing in at 160. We were going for dry as a bone in many cases. So upper 140s even, trying to dry it out, because that dryness is what really lets the hops shine, right? We began to pay attention to the minerality of our beers. There's an interesting relationship between calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, and perceived bitterness. Okay. And then more importantly, we began relying on what's known as non-measurable or non-specified bitterness that actually comes from dry hopping. So it's not just the terpene fraction, but it's like the fact that the soft resins are contributing towards all this other, I'd say, like magical mouthfeel, right? We always come back to like the steak knife dragging down your tongue, or what does resinous mean?
Yeah,
that type of thing, and that comes from dry hopping.
Yeah. So that changed to me. I know it maybe feels like a long time, but it's not been a long time, and that change to me sort of happened so rapidly, where we kind of hung on to the recipe for a while. That stayed there a while, the crystal malt, the balance. But then very quickly, with the late hopping, with the drying it out, where did this body of, and including, by the way, the minerality, where did this body of knowledge like emerge from what seemed like overnight? Is it just because IPA was so popular and y'all were brewing so much of it? Experience, in other words?
I mean, I just remember a time, I'll take a step back, Jeremy, when you were talking about the mashing in at 160, there was this school of thought that these beers were so bitter, the only way to balance them out was to mash high, add a bunch of caramel malt, and that sweetness was supposed to balance the bitterness. So you're just making this like super heavy duty beer, right? And then we all realized like drinkability.
Support the hops. You got to support them.
But I mean, that's what everybody talked about. And then, you start brewing, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, in our brewery, it was just like we kept enjoying like the better we got with our yeast and healthy yeast and better and fermentations, and played around with those lowering the mash temperatures. All of a sudden the hops started coming out. And the nuances of the hops.
Yeah.
And I can't speak for your breweries, but at Goose we had learned, because we'd gone out to the West Coast and brewed with Deschutes, about these really late like whirlpool hopping, and we started leaning more and more to whirlpool hopping. And the more we threw in the whirlpool, we were getting isomerization there. So we had to back more and more out of the front end and the middle. And you're always trying to find a place to remove the early hops so you could add more in the late. And we even had recipes that were like, there weren't even any kettle hops. They're just like everything was going in the whirlpool. And this is still in the 90s, really, So I think that was kind of from my perspective what was going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, even on the Brewing Network, the Brewing Network's first show was in 2005. And I remember for the first 6 months or a year, every interview we did that we talked IPAs was still this crystal malt recipe you're talking about. Yep. Now, there was talk of dryness. We had Vinny on the shows back then. There was talk about that. But still, we always heard about middle edition hops and crystal malt. But I'm telling you, by 2006, like within a year of the show, brewers were coming on the show and they're like, middle edition, what? I don't think about that anymore. Just whirlpool. And slowly they got to the only whirlpool, like you just mentioned, Matt. For a while it was, well, you still got to put your bitter in your whirlpool. But it just around that like middle, 2005, 2006, it happened fast. And in my opinion, for the good, because now it's been sort of experimental ever since, right? You guys just keep driving further and further into the style.
I feel for me, like down here in Southern California, breweries that were showing that off, like in pretty cool ways, were breweries like Alpine, where these beers are just getting really light in color, and they're all about that super aromatic. It's all about flavor and aroma with the IPA instead of the IBU sort of war. And I think the same goes for breweries like Pizza Port, with how dry those beers continued to become. And, it wasn't about supporting the hops with this caramel malt thing. Vinny had already been doing it, for a while. as well. And so it is interesting, like, so many brewers sort of having this beer that is just like Jeremy was talking about with these really high sort of chewy, sweeter IPAs, where people are putting a lot of caramel malt in them. They're, Burtonizing the water, and they're using so much sulfate because they read an article that that's what they're supposed to do, because that's how IPA used to be in England, apparently. And so, instead of just taking it from a standpoint of like, what tastes good to me. And I don't know. I mean, the sort of IBU war that we all kind of saw there for a while is similar to like the sour war that we saw in sour beer as well. Who can make the most sour beer? And it's
right.
Like, well, we can all make the most bitter beer. We can make the most sour beer, but like, the whole goal is to just hopefully be able to drink the thing. And so I know for me and like my palate and my brewing, like I just kind of ended up there by tweaking the beer every batch, from batch to batch, and then continuing to go, you know what? Every time I bring out the caramel malt, I like it more. And so it tastes less oxidized the more caramel malt I take out. So then I just continue to take out the caramel malt and get the body leaner, work on the water profile, and a range of these other things. But it's just like, it is interesting though, exactly what you're saying, where there was this switch, where just immediately, like out of nowhere, everyone kind of started, pulling these things out.
And to listen to you,
2006 switch.
The 06 switch. That's right. We just invented that here on the show, Jeremy. Thank you. And hearing you describe it that way, Evan, just that's not good.
Nice
makes me think that you guys sort of followed, hey, this is how it was supposed to be done for long enough, and then you became emboldened by your own successes. You became emboldened by your I'm going to experiment with removing it. And I think that has so much to do with the evolution of the IPA. And before we jump even further ahead, I would be remiss if I didn't land at like some of the unique IPAs that came out when we started messing with black IPAs. This one's Black Rye Ipa, which just won a medal. Matt, good job.
Actually, Sam brewed that down at the Propagator. So, like Jeremy, really? I can't take any credit for brewing the thing.
And another Central Coast brewery just sent a black IPA up to us from Liquid Gravity. That reminded me that I love black IPAs. That they shouldn't have just been this flash in the pan.
What happened? They all hatched again. Like they all went away, and then it rained and they hatched.
And then boom, they're back. I'm going to crack this one over. But they're to like the experimentalism of the IPA, right? Like the Pacific Northwest wanted to make it their own in some ways, is kind of how the story goes, I guess. But there's always this way to experiment with the style.
So I was going to ask both of you, in your experience, like going from these, caramel malt based, pulling it out, did you also drop the IBUs down as you went? Is Lagunitas IPA and now Evan, like your West Coast, Union Jack used to have a target of 75, which was hard to even get there after, fermentation and everything. And it's not that anymore.
Lagunitas definitely dropped. It went from around 70 to currently it's at 50.
Yeah.
And even 50 is starting to feel too high for the times, but that crystal malt is still there. And in that beer, our philosophy towards other IPAs really went towards like little something, something in particular. It really went towards softening the BU and bringing the dry hop up, right? The philosophy being the later you use something in the brewing process, the more it kind of shines, right? In a naked way. The more you're chewing on the hop cone, the more you're taking your face to Yakima in September, all those nice things. So that I think that definitely set the stage to talk a little bit of what Evan mentioned. he talked about the what way I think of it was the IBU pissing match that was going on in the in the 2000s. Who would think that, because every action has an equal opposite reaction and practice precedes theory, that the 100 IBU movement would end in 0 BU, but like 7 pound per barrel hazies. You know,
Right.
the quest for the crystal clear 100 IBU double IPA now lands us the 0 BU, 7 pound per barrel murky chicken stock delicious thing, right? So.
Yeah, we did 12 recently. That was that wasn't, I mean, I don't know, that's kind of a waste. 12 pounds per barrel. And that, hazy double.
Saturation gradient.
Well, it was actually a mistake is the funny part, because I thought it was a double batch in the tank, and it was a single batch. And so I quadruple dry hopped it on accident, and it was awful. Like, it just goes to show you that, you do too much of something. It reminded me of, if you guys ever did this, at BJ's, we would have these cask nights. And so for me, I'd be like, oh dude, doing cask night, man, I'm going to, next week. So I'm going to put so much hops in that cask. Holy shit. And then you'd have this cask that just literally tastes so insanely overly extracted and bitter, all from the dry hop in there. And it's absolutely awful.
And you'd cough on the powder as I was drinking those. I'd get
the hop burn.
It just kind of gets you. The Rye Black IPA is fantastic, by the way.
So Jeremy, you mentioned 50 IBUs ish on Lagunitas IPA. Evan, Radiant Beauty, and some of your other West Coast. What's the target?
Well, I. My answer sucks. So
I know your answer. I'm going to love it.
No. My answer is funny because I don't test. So I don't really know. I think one time I sent beer to you guys to test it for me, and we came in at 65 IBUs, I want to say. And that really surprised me because my target IBU bittering charge is 110. And so I mean, we use a lot of hop to bitter the beer, and I think it ends up just being one of those things that it's really about the water profile, the salts you're using, the pH, the range of these sort of things that are whether or not you're going to extract a fair amount of bitterness out of those hops, or maybe just add a really nice fullness to them that you're still getting that. There you go, some Pet the Tiger.
So is that also hopped in a similar way, where you think that it's calcs up over 100, but analytically it's gonna. And Jeremy,
because that's not even taking into consideration Whirlpool Edition and dry hopping. So that's just bittering charges only.
But there's clearly a saturation point. And I mean, I feel like when 75 was the target on Union Jack, it was almost impossible to consistently get there. It was almost like we should just lower the analytical spec to 70 so we can feel like we're in spec and quit trying to hit this almost impossible number. Jeremy, did you find a saturation point in your brewery?
Oh, absolutely. It's just like a distiller trying to reach, 100% ethanol or, 200 proof. It's the harder you try to get there, the more disappointed you'll be. But the big thing that we've learned, and I truly love where Evan is at, right? Like not having an analytical lab, that doesn't feel like that far away from where we were at, because you do everything to your sensory standard, right? Because the nose knows.
Yep.
And the taste tells. And ultimately, that's the best lab equipment you'll ever need. And so, but we did find that the yeast strain matters a lot with BU loss and terpene loss. So in other words, you could have 100 wort BUs and post-fermentation as little as 50 to 70, but you could switch strains. You could do the same recipe with a gentle Bavarian lager yeast, and it would be completely different. It would be much less, right?
Wow.
So in other words, the more explosive the fermentation is, the more of that BU loss you're going to have. But then you come in and we're going to dry hop. That's another thing that I think we all as IPA brewers learned in the 90s and 2000s that we didn't know had a name. Later, it got a name. It was called biotransformation. But we learned a lot about like the timing of the dry hop.
Yes.
Like, in other words, I call it I dry hopped my beer too late. Why does it taste like cantaloupes and watermelons?
Catchy name.
Yeah.
Evan's going to steal that one. You better trademark it quick.
It's already taken, Matt. It's a crowded space.
I mean, the timing of the dry hop is so insanely important. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of people, a lot of that conversation comes up a lot with Hazy IPA and Hazy IPA brewers as they are, or as we are looking at, getting some biotransformation depending on like whether or not you have to harvest yeast or not. But I think it's an interesting sort of aspect of how those hops are going to express themselves in that beer, because the amount of times that we trial this out all the time in our brewery of just what is that exact moment for each beer style, for West Coast IPA or for actually even a specific varietal, as an example for me so far, like Sabro is a hop variety that is extremely polarizing and isn't necessarily something I'm overly excited about for its like sunscreen sort of character. And it's like, coconut.
Little coconut, yeah.
The coconut like suntan lotion, And so anyway, but that hop added at day 2 of fermentation totally like transforms into something that is super dope and is actually a coconut character that for me and my palate isn't polarizing anymore, and it opens up a little bit more and becomes something different. And I think the same comes for just dry hopping in general. I mean, that warmer fermentation, like for us in our brewery, I mean, we're dry hopping beer in the presence of yeast, and I think that that's important. We end up with beer that's less dank. We end up with IPAs that are more fruity. And the moment that we say drop that temp, we're getting, so much more vegetal, danker sort of characters in those beers. And the moment that we even allow yeast to settle out more is another aspect of that entire thing. So Matt, the beer you're drinking, actually, we experimented with waiting another day for more yeast to settle out, because we would continue to be talking about the sulfur compound. I can't think of it at the moment from fermentation, but anyway, so we wanted to get more yeast to settle out, so we dry hopped it a day later than we normally do, and we had to let it sit for a little bit longer. And we watched the beer go from clear, and then over the course of like 2 days, it finally was starting this fermentation again. And we really started to see that activity kind of come up as it's going through its creep. But the aromatics and the hop aromatics on that beer specifically weren't as rich and as punchy as other beers that we make, because of just not having that timing done correctly. Timing done the way that we personally, or I personally like it.
Yeah. So
methyl mercaptan, I think, was the word you were looking for.
Mercaptan, thank you. Yeah, we've been like, continuing to have mercaptan here and there, and I think it's something that's probably always honestly been in the beer. And at a certain point, like, you're smelling something and you go, "Oh, I don't like this now. What is that?" And so it's just interesting as we all kind of grow as tasters and brewers, the things that might have always been there that just all of a sudden are just in clear view at a certain day at a certain point.
Jeremy, do you have a strategy for, not to get too geeky or techie, but for managing mercaptan in your process? Is it hop selection driven as well, or is it timing of a dry hop?
It all starts with taking everything I learned at UC Davis and every lecture from Charlie Bamforth and Dr. Lewis and all the books, and usually putting them in the brew kettle and throwing all of it, because I learned I learned that all these things that were associated as negative flavors, like methyl mercaptan, and various thiol, which is like a sulfurous terpene, were considered negative. But the thing is, they were considered negative to lager beer.
Yes.
And, we Justin did a really good job of steering us away from the history of IPA, like long ago. But, a big thing about it is that the English were the ones that brought us dry hopping. The most Reinheitsgebot thing, beer can only be made with these four things. And, flash forward hundreds of years later, and brewers are getting all kinds of fruit compounds out of their hops.
Yep.
And I think part of it is what Evan has been talking about, the timing of the dry hop and the importance of hop selection, which and I know that there is Lagunitas is infamous in the valley, the entire valley, for preferring a certain profile that we call it a let it hang profile, right? If the Amarillo is perfect on a Monday, Lagunitas will love it on a Friday.
Oh my God.
And we're notorious for that, because we like that extra expression of cattiness, sulfur, all the things that the brewing professors that I can remember that I really strongly look up to would phrase as a negative thing, right? Like catty and onion, garlic, OG, all that kind of stuff. There is a breaking point though, where it goes too far. But the timing, the hop choice selection, the timing of the harvest, the timing of the dry hop, I like to think of those as like two very important buckets that live on two very different lands. And just the fact that sometimes brewers, like the whole like hazy is lazy thing, haha, that's funny. Well, I know hazy brewers that are so worried about getting the timing right that they just opt to throw the hops in the fermenter and cool in on top of them. And Matt, I very distinctly remember you telling me years ago of a larger brewery that was doing just this before we had ever heard the word biotransformation.
Yeah. Widmer.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Boom. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that, but
it's okay. He can edit.
So,
yeah, that's right.
But
I won't.
Just to keep going on that, because I think it's actually something I haven't heard anybody really nail, is that so you pick ripe and you got, it's just, there's all sorts of stuff going on there, good and bad. There's a lot of sulfur compounds, but you just know you're going to get all that ripe, just good stuff. And so are you saying that if you can get it in like, I'm not saying mid-firm, but with some yeast activity so do you think it's biotransformation? Do you think it's CO2 evolution, removing the really volatile stuff and allowing the other mid oils to hang? Or, what is it in your mind?
Well, in my mind, it starts in the field, with we're lucky enough that we brew enough beer to where we have those relationships with the farmers, and, the terpene expression of the sulfur thiols is going to happen towards the tail end, right? So you lock that in as best as you can. In the reality of their picking equipment and their labor and all those real world like obstacles that they face, you compromise, you get that right. And then depending on your yeast type, that's a big thing. Like we all live in this world of our yeast types. And we bring a guest yeast type in, and it can really wreak havoc on our brewery. Like here, to put it in perspective, like some yeast don't biotransform hardly at all, right? Whereas others are slutty and just go at it, and they're the ultimate hop creep. When you Google hop creep, you bring up that yeast, but It is a compromise of what happens in the field and knowing your yeast type and getting that timing right. And then the other thing, you alluded to another very, very important point, is that I call fermentation, or I think of it as the second boil, right? It's your next chance to boil off the volatiles, but you do it at a much lower boiling point.
Love that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that entire comment is pretty cool, because I continue to feel like we deal with the same sort of thing with that, that timing of when to dry hop, where it's just like, there's certain things that you don't want to last in what it is, and having that blow off, or having that hopefully, transform a little bit, ends up being like, for our expression, it's, very fruit driven. Like it's, hopefully it's not, there's a reminder of, say, cannabis there, but it's not, it's not full garlic onion, it's not full dank, and instead it's just like that little kiss. But it's like the second boil comment's pretty dope.
Oh yeah. I want to take this opportunity to bring to kind of tie this together, bring the consumer palate into this conversation a little bit, because I think it fits right here as we sort of transition into what is a new school IPA now, or hazy. I don't even know what a new school IPA is. You guys brew them so differently. Everybody does. That is one, Pet the Tiger, for anybody just listening to the podcast. By the way, it was Wookie Jack that I don't think I said, I just held up the can to the video viewers. But so, you guys talking about the IBU wars, I think is a good transition to all of this too, because you guys, brewers, play the IBU wars so well that it translated over to the consumers too, where the beer nerds, the question was how many IBUs are in the beer. That was a common conversation at the bar among craft beer consumers. I don't hear that conversation anymore, lending to exactly what Evan kind of described, where he's not even measuring it. And I think there's a real reason for that. It's not because Evan's eccentric, although he can be. It's because the consumer palate is not, just as Evan is not as interested in the bitterness value of a beer anymore. And so now, and this is where I'm getting at, now when my customers come into the Hop Grenade to buy your beers, they talk about hops by name. They don't ask me what the most alcoholic beer is anymore. They don't ask me how many IBUs. I can't remember the last time I've been asked about IBUs. But you're damn sure they know the names of hop varietals, and they have favorites, and they're fans of this one. And even this old dog now does too. I've started to discover. So Jeremy, Matt taught me about hop varietals. I started interviewing Matt early on, and he was kind of our hop expert at the Brewing Network. And he taught me about the names of different hops and hop varietals. Jeremy taught me exactly what you guys just talked about, which was how the same varietal can be different. Jeremy taught me that I actually can like Simcoe, because he gave me the super catty one. He's like, this is the one you don't like. He's like, by the way, we kind of do. And then he gave me the one that's less catty. And I was like, oh, Simcoe's good. He's like, yeah, I know. You drink Russian River, so you like Simcoe. You just didn't know it. He taught me how this variation. Okay, point being, consumers now know this shit too. And they're so excited when they're like, oh, it's a mosaic beer. I have to try that. Oh, you put Strata in it? Oh, I can't wait to get Evan's Strata beer. Like, that's now where part of where this new school is, right? So Jeremy, hop growing, and I know you know this too, Matt, and has come so far along with, there is not this evolution of the IPA that we're in now without the growers playing along with you, is kind of what I'm getting at.
I mean, back in the early days, Justin, we actually had to know how to brew, because all we had was Cascade and Centennial and Chinook. And then one day, I think of hops like boy bands, we were back in the early days, and then we had NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys.
Right.
That was Simcoe and Amarillo. Okay. And then all of a sudden, the freaking Beebs busted out onto the scene. Oh my God, the Beebs! That's Citra, right? Right. And then now we have these polarizing TikTok stars. That's Sabro. But let's not lose sight of the fact that breeding is an art form unto itself as well, and it's a very exciting thing. that for folks like Matt and I truly hope Evan as well, although we were a little bit robbed of our hop harvest this last thing, because that's where we all come together and invade, and they were like, it's COVID. We're getting your wildfires up here. I was like, why are they my wildfires? They were like, we're grumpy. So we took
Jeremy,
a year
let
off.
me just clarify for any consumers listening or watching. What Jeremy's saying is that, they used to get to go up to Washington and pick the hops, not pick them off the field, but pick their lot, go through them, really select with the growers, with the distributors. And that got, like everything else, disrupted by COVID. And it was more of a Zoom experience of hop selection, which clearly changed things for you, Jeremy.
Well, it's just the fact that these breeding programs and these just knockout varieties that I feel like kind of truly started with Simcoe, and the fact that there's like an early, middle, and a late Simcoe, like it goes from like, floral to grapefruit to cat piss, just like you were talking about, in varying degrees of pine and trees and things. So the brewers began to really care and to really want to know their hop farmers. And then we got together with the hop farmers. And the thing that we realized is that these guys were a lot like us. They were like these cool guys and gals that really had this passion for what they did. And they were just huge nerds, and they loved to go and drink beer, and they would tolerate hanging out in an aquarium of farts late night
to learn about their craft.
Yes. We were bonded together and marinating in one another's emissions.
and Jeremy, just to put a fine point on that, the ones that I have interviewed are, several generations of hop farmers, and these new generations that you're talking about, the ones that you've been hanging out with, they are excited about hops. Just, they inherited the family business, but want to make it their own. And these new hop varieties and how they did that are part of their story. That's their mark on the family legacy.
Matt could add some color to this, but I truly feel that craft brewing saved the valley. And when I say that, I mean we saved these, in some cases, 6 or 7 generation farms. A lot of them, came over. Typically, their ancestors immigrated over from France, and we saved these farms from the banks. I mean, craft saved them, and it's a beautiful story. We made their kids want to come back and get interested, and now they're opening up breweries up there and brewing great beer themselves. It's truly beautiful what's happening.
Yeah, it's true.
And those of you consumers,
I hope that happens. I think it's happening in New Zealand and Australia to some extent, and then maybe New Zealand more so. And I don't know if that's happening in Germany yet. And I just hope that hop region can somehow be saved by this same wave. They've been a little stubborn to come along for the ride. But
that's a provocative point, Matt, because the people listening to this are probably unaware of the size of the average German hop farm and how much smaller they are. And so how much more, localized they are. And I haven't really thought about that. I often think about how they lack the irrigation. So they're more kind of subject to the forces of Mother Nature. All it takes is one bad thing in Germany, and we're all paying more for our hops. So we're like pissed at Germany,
Yeah, and for those who don't already or haven't heard it before, and what Jeremy's talking about, I mean, the average U.S. hop farm now is at least 500 acres, and I think most of these guys have grown to closer to 1,000 acres, and there's about 75 to 80 of them. In Germany, it's literally, a mule and a couple of folks. I mean, we're talking like 40 acres is a big farm in Germany. There's
massive.
There's like 1,500 approximate spread across a fairly large area. And they are truly family small enterprises. It's like dad's running the picker, grandpa's running the kiln, and the oldest son is driving the tractor back and forth from the field. And they can pretty much do that with maybe 2 hired hands that came in from Poland for the harvest. And that's a German hop farm.
Well, and Matt and I were going to do an episode with hop farmers and on hop farming and on hop breeding to really cover this, because you just don't get to talk about craft beer without talking about hops, whatever size of the farm, really. I do want to kind of use that.
I was going to actually, before we get too far away from a point that Jeremy was driving towards, and I think Evan might have a cool take on this. So you were talking about this idea that consumers are now keyed into varieties, and just like wine drinkers, they may even know like a little bit about the terroir, like where it was grown, and they might even get into early harvest, late harvest. I mean, that's how keyed into these hop varieties they are potentially. But I love this concept of just taking it to the next level, like the cannabis industry has. And do you foresee, either of you, a time when we're actually talking about the terpenes, we're talking about the actual compounds that we're focusing on that are hop driven, hop derived, maybe biotransformed? And is that something we're going to put on the label, or at least on our websites at some point?
Pretty cool idea for sure. I mean, the evolution that we've already kind of seen in the marketplace for IPA has been so much fun, where in the last, 10 years or something, we've continued to see more and more breweries continue to put, what hops are being used into these beers, instead of it just being this elusive, like, hey, here's my IPA. Seeing stuff like Citra be just, maybe quite possibly one of the biggest hop varietals as far as like the Pinot Noir of beer, where it's just like people see that, they see Citra and they immediately go, you know what, I think I'm going to like that. And you're like, well, I mean, that brewer could have totally messed it up, but sure, right. Like let's try it out. I mean, I absolutely, I can see things continuing to get geekier and geekier as all of us continue to go down the rabbit hole and continue to get like, and just kind of nerd out on all of what this is, just early harvest versus mid versus late on, these different picks, as an example, like you said, is just like, maybe just the tip of the iceberg. And then the other things you said are a little above my head.
But Jeremy, I know you're studying that stuff. So do you think that's something that's like consumable by the consumer, so to speak?
Evan just gave me this great idea that our friends at Yakima Chief and Haas would kill us. But we IPA brewers, we could deliberately brew Citra beers that suck as a kind of like Robin Hood, Reddit GameStop kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
And we could crush that hop and let a new one rise in its place. But no, I would never do that. That's a beautiful hop.
Yeah, and then we'll all get the the better price, because the price is going to drop. I think that can work out pretty well for us.
Well, keep in mind, Evan, one thing we cannot change is the yield per acre. So the Riwakas and the Citras are never going to produce like a Columbus or something that makes more. That's ultimately, I think, popularity does drive the price, but yield per acre, I think, is the primary driver. But back to the terpenes, I personally, I have, as Justin knows, I have one, and Matt and probably Evan too, but I have kind of 1 foot in the cannabis side and then 1 foot in the hop side, and I'm watching the two worlds collide and very happy about it all. But I also, hearing that our friends in the analytical world, at the Hopsteiner, Yakima Chief, Haas are. And in the cannabis side are identifying 300, 400, 500, 600 monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes, really de-romanticizing both plants, which of course 25 million years ago were the same plant. An important point that connects the two, right? Because as the plant was evolving, the cannabis plant said, I'm okay with no water and I'll stay in the savannas. The dry areas, and then the hop plant was like, oh, I need a shit ton of water, so it chased the creek beds, right? And that's how it kind of diverged evolutionarily. And so they're both, terpene factories. One makes alpha acid, the other one makes cannabinoids, but the terpene part is largely the same. And I don't know, as soon as you start throwing around, alpha pinene, terpineol, caryophyllene, myrcene, I've found in my experience that excites the cannabis people more than it excites the beer people for some reason. And it's probably because that those terpenes have been found to have medicinal and kind of health and wellness benefits when combined with CBD and the other cannabinoids. Whereas us brewers, we are beholden to a lot of major regulation that does not allow us to ever preach about benefits. That's why I look at what's happening with seltzer, and it's like now with superfoods and antioxidants, and I'm like, whoa, playing with fire there, buddy. Like that is, no matter how you phrase it, you can't make health claim, so that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah.
That was awesome, man. You just dropped some knowledge. That was
absolutely.
That was incredible.
Yes. And I think, it kind of goes hand in hand, Jeremy. To answer, if I can answer your question too, Matt, I think yes. I think the simple answer is yes, that consumers will start to talk about these compounds. And the reason, it just kind of piggybacking on Jeremy, is it's also just part of the information age. We now not only do know more, but want to know more about everything that we're into. And we have access to it. And the more you brewers learn about it, the more we learn about it. And so I think that just the world at large goes hand in hand with consumers knowing more about terpenes and maybe even later finding out their own health effects so that you don't have to tell them illegally, Jeremy. I don't see how it could go other way. Hops aren't going away. IPAs are not going away. I mean, it's such an amazing journey to watch. And we got to land on hazy beer before we run out of time and some of these new school things. And I want to start that by saying that that you brewers and hop varietals have reminded me that I like beer and hops. The Brewing Network can be a little curmudgeonly. Certain members of the Brewing Network especially can be a little curmudgeonly about the IPA and about hops. And COVID got me back to work in my tap room on a daily basis. And in order for me to responsibly sell beer to my guests, I wanted to be able to give them honest recommendations. So I just started trying a lot of beer again. And it turns out I like Diesel. And it turns out I like Dank. And it turns out Jeremy's right, that a little caddy has a place in things. And it turns out, Evan, don't shy completely away from that sulfur. Like all of these things, it's really reminded me how much I like beer and how much I like hops. And so, Evan, I kind of want to throw this at you because I feel like my impression of you is that when you walk into your brewery, you might feel like the world is your oyster because you get to now just be a part of this like new school. No, is that because when I taste your beer, that's how I feel. I'm like, wow, Evan had fun that day. Like he had a lot of fun.
I love hearing that. I love that. Yeah, no, I was just having a conversation with my buddy Bob on the way to work today. And we were talking about like owning a business and how difficult it is and everything. And I when I walk into work, I get humbled on a daily basis as I walk through and I taste the tanks and I smell the tanks. Again, I'm humbled by certain things that we are, battling, or certain things that are happening in each different tank. But I like this positive direction so much more. Let's go in your direction.
Just adopt it. It's fine. But you must love to experiment. I mean, if nothing else, you love
absolutely
to challenge yourself with these beers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I love continuing to tweak everything all the time, which is one of the things with our beer that I do talk about pretty regularly, is this idea that consistency is cool. Consistency is great, but and if you want to taste the exact same thing every time, you might need to go to another brewery because that's not going to be us.
Okay.
We're constantly tweaking and evolving every single beer to a point that sometimes it's, it can be a little aggressive. It can be just like a little, smidgen of a change. But either way, the constant experimentation is so much fun. Having the exact same recipe and continuing to just tweak a yeast strain, the same exact hop, but from a different farm, and a range of these other things is just like never endlessly so interesting.
Sure. So then kind of a broader question to all three of you for that would be, and Jeremy, I love that you kind of alluded to it earlier where people are like, oh, hazy is lazy. I think the opposite. I feel like hazy gave you brewers a challenge, a new challenge, something else to do. And part of that is because you've all had good ones and you've all had bad ones and you're like, shit, what's the good one? What makes it? How do you get it that way? How does it stay hazy? How is it the thing that consumers want? Like to me, hazy beer, I found people who don't like beer all of a sudden like beer because it's not overly bitter and they're like, oh, it says IPA on it. I won't like it. Try this. And they like it. So I feel like it gave you this new realm to enter. Jeremy, do you find that that's something it did for you?
Absolutely. And to tie it in with something that Matt was talking about earlier, because I like to think about the two great brewing traditions on the planet. One of them is English, and they gave us dry hopping, and the other one is German. And we were just talking about the Germans. And the Germans gave us Hefeweizen. And what did Hefeweizen teach us? It taught us that drinking hazy beer was okay, right? And at some point, a brewer, presumably on the East Coast, thought about Hefeweizen and thought about dry hopping, and probably also thought about how dry hopping makes all of our beers acutely hazy. And that had previously been bothering us, right? Because we had been obsessing over our West Coast IPAs that need to be crystal clear and they can't have schlarf in them. And I will work on the Wikipedia entry for schlarf.
Thank you.
I will get that posted. But, the idea that not filtering our beers would let more hop compounds come over. I'll never forget looking at a scanning electron micrograph of our beer once. And it wasn't even a particularly hoppy beer, but they noted lupulin granules in the beer. And I got like a little brewer mini Chubs. I was like, lupulin granules, Chubs.
You're like, that's awesome.
That's so cool. And then that dry hopping can cause haze, and then using the schlarfy grains, oats and unmalted cereal adjuncts. But I'd be remiss to not point out that back to the Germans, the yeast matters. The yeast is the ultimate vehicle for the haze.
Evan and the world, I give you Jeremy Marshal. Like if you want something broken down in a way that we all love and understand, you invite Jeremy Marshal to the show. Is what you do.
Amen. Amen.
I do love that you brought up the Hefeweizen, right? In my curmudgeonly days, I'd be like, oh, it's just a half, or it's hazy because it's a homebrew and we could never clear up the beers. But it's become so much more than that. Matt, I know you have an opinion on hazy.
No, I mean, it's so funny that you brought it up because that was the only way that I could do it, is to try to like dip back and look at history and like, how does this make sense, this hazy IPA? And exactly that, it led me to Germany and the masters of top fermented hazy beers. The only obstacle in their world was that they chose, phenolic yeasts, which don't necessarily work all the time great with hops, but they also had super isoamyl or banana driven yeast that fruity ester works great with hops. So they're kind of the masters of it. And I guess our approach when we built Mind Haze was to kind of take this approach of like, basically I'm making a Bavarian style wheat beer, trying to remove the phenolics and add a lot of hop esters and fun stuff. And yeah, absolutely. And Evan, when you launched Green Cheek, because, you know, I feel like I was kind of like there, like, oh, Evan's doing this thing. And then I remember you calling me going, yeah. And like the first couple of beers I'm launching are hazies. I was like, whoa, okay, that's what we're doing. Because I remember you
going right into it.
The lager guy. And I remember from Noble, like,
Oh yeah,
cranking out these insane IPAs. And then I feel like that totally influenced, and correct me if I'm wrong, Radiant Beauty and some of the West Coast IPAs, because then you started kicking out these beers with some tropical, interesting hop character on the West Coast side as well. So, I mean, was there any tie-in on the influence there?
I mean, I feel like that in regards to like what, like, well, the West Coast IPA, like trying to get these beers more fresh, tropical, fruity, all of these different aromatics, like I give this guy too much credit too often, but Tim from Cellar Maker is one of those guys that makes some of the best smelling IPAs for me, where I talk to him constantly. I mean, like I talked to him yesterday. Like I'm always just like, I feel like it's such a funny conversation because I'm just like always asking, like, what are you not telling me? Like we select hops together. We share a lot of the same lots. But when I smell his beer versus my beer, I'm always just like, man, the aromatics on your beer are so cool. And so anyway, I think that there has to be an influence there, whether I realize it or not. You know, just continuing to go through. And you know, the smell and the taste of hazy IPAs are it's pretty insane how hazy IPA tastes fresh versus how it continues to age. Where I feel like clear IPA or West Coast IPA doesn't have the same long lasting effects of whatever this yeast and hop combo is able to do. It all, like, hazy IPAs end up like kind of all getting muddled into this same sort of spot that a hazy IPA old ends up tasting better than a West Coast IPA old for my palate.
Interesting.
And so it's interesting to me because as I look at like ratings on Untapped and stuff like that, I look at these different beers and I think that, like, you know, the hazy IPA just ends up having this shelf life that is so damn good that people talk about aging these beers for over a month until they decide to finally drink them, which is, I mean, I'm sure a lot has to do that with hop bite, but also they just end up having a better flavor profile, I guess, for some people. But you're
blowing my mind right now. This is the opposite that I've heard most brewers say, and that I would have expected to hear you say. But I also think I understand what you mean. I am, since I love West Coast IPAs so much, I am fully aware how quickly and almost overnight, like that. Sometimes
depending on the brewer, because oxygen is such a huge part of all of this, you know. But it's like, an old West Coast IPA, is just a shell of itself. And we try to, at our brewery, we try to tell people to drink within 3 weeks, keep it cold and drink within 3 weeks. But we also have the luxury of, handing people cans the day that we are canning, and immediately putting them on for sale and stuff like that too. So it's just like, that's a much more difficult thing to do, the larger you get.
You guys hit on something, Evan, you hit on it. You said oxygen, and remember, where there's life, there tends to not be oxidation, right? Have you ever been shocked over how good barrel-aged beer can taste, which in theory should be massively oxidized?
Yes.
And this is important because it looks like I'm broadcasting from inside of a barrel. Right. But, where there's life, there's no oxidation. So you have yeast, and back to the scanning electron micrograph of the lupulin. So there's probably a lot of like really complex, chemical reactions and biological reactions happening in a canned hazy that we don't get the luxury of happening in a canned, very clear, filtered West Coast style IPA, because we don't have the lupulin granules, we don't have the yeast, we don't have the schlarf.
We don't no schlurf.
Yeah, no schlarf.
And I was going to add to that as well. It's like, yeah, if the yeast is happy and it's continuing to gobble up oxygen, do whatever it's doing, and then a lot of those beers are packaged young, right? So like you said, some of the hop burn is dropping out. But there is this other element that I know to be true, and I don't necessarily understand all the chemistry of it. I mean, SO2 chemistry is well documented with lager yeast. When you produce metabisulfite, you scavenge oxygen until it's all gone. But we're talking about both yeast and hops, that there's a lot of sulfur chemistry going on. And where that plays with the longevity of the product and flavor development. I think there's something there. That's about all I can say about it. But I think, those two things are what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because I know that we can go on this topic forever and ever, I think that's a perfect point to cap our conversation on IPAs. Also, Matt, I've decided during our first podcast that our decision on the longevity of a podcast is when we all have to pee, which I know is right now. And I'm like, I know that you guys are feeling like me. And I'm like, you know what? We covered the topic to the point where we have to use the restroom. End of episode.
Yeah.
We could never cover all things IPA in one episode anyway. So, stay tuned for future podcasts with Matt and I and future guests. But Jeremy and Evan, we couldn't have asked for two more fun and two more knowledgeable guests for our first podcast. I want to thank you.
The bar has been set high.
Oh, yeah, I mean, Jeremy, right. Dude, Jeremy dropping knowledge, though.
Yeah, Jeremy's always
incredible.
I can't wait to travel again so that we can do this in person and also marinate in that aquarium of farts once again.
Yeah, the one part we don't miss, we almost kind of miss.
We miss it.
Oh, man.
Sulfur.
Yeah, I don't miss the beer festival farts, man. I mean, that's just like, you're just everybody.
That's why Matt's festival's outdoors,
Yeah, you got to do it outdoors. Don't sell too many tickets.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jeremy from Lagunitas Brewing Company and Evan from Green Cheek Beer Company. Check them out. Two very knowledgeable, awesome brewers. Matt, hey, good job on your first podcast hosting.
Well, I was just following your lead, man.
Cool. Well, we've got more to come on the Beer Before Glory podcast, and we're going to have a lot of fun doing it, talking about more topics. In fact, we're going to do a whole episode on Hazy IPA, which is part of the reason I sort of wrapped this up here, because we can really dive into it and get some more experts on here to talk about that product that you love so much. So with that, we're going to take off out of here. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Thanks to Matt, Jeremy, and Evan for being here. And Matt, we'll see you next time.
Oh, man, I can't wait. Thanks, you guys. That was awesome. Well done.
Take care of yourselves.
Cheers.
And your beer.
Cheers.
Cheers.
The Brewing Network.